Okay, so we continue.
This
Okay.
meeting is being recorded. Continue. Yes.
I know we're missing. Donald, but let's get going because we've got about an hour to get through this. So welcome. I believe we're now all being recorded. Smile for the camera. Hello, welcome to the third Clown Power discussion, brought to you by Dave Spafficki. So last week we had two women and non-binary artists talking about what it is for them to be clowning. And then we all agreed that there's nuanced ways of clowning that celebrate differences. And today, as per the other two Zoom webinars, we have two audiences. There is the audience here on Zoom, and there is the audience out there listening live. If you miss it or you have to dash away, it's also going to be streamed via YouTube, so you'll see that later. If you are on Zoom and listening, please send in any questions that you might have like to ask. A quick plea, times are tough, times are hard in these very strange circumstances, but we're asking you to donate money, whatever you can afford right now in these poxy times, and links for the donation will be posted. I have to say Dave Spafficki is putting a lot of hours into making these discussions happen, and we're very privileged to have people coming along and talking. And I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome the panelists we have today. We are missing one and hoping he's going to come along, but so far please welcome Avner the eccentric, Olly Crick, and Howard Patterson. And I'm going to ask you all to introduce yourselves properly in a moment or two. But before I do, today's focus is the clown and the cultural context. So what's important for them looking back and in the here and now, or even looking forward. And I'm going to be asking questions, and hopefully people on Zoom will be asking questions, and for your points of view. But first of all, hello, Donald. We've got Donald. Hello, welcome, Donald.
Hi, Maggie.
Hello, thank you. Glad you could make it. We've got the full panel. This is great. So I'm going to ask you each, could you please introduce yourselves a little bit about your background and maybe even an inspiration. So kick off. Olly.
Well,
Avner.
Right. I did drama at university a long time ago, and some fool said commedia to me, but they didn't kind of explain kind of what it was. So I spent the rest of my life trying to find it. I've been a street performer at Covent Garden when I first met Dave, being a juggler, then met a bunch of people, a bunch of art students from Liverpool who've been trained by Carlo Bozo, whose acting was okay, that's me being polite, but they had wonderful kit because they were art students and could make stuff. And all the information you could get in books on commedia at that time was very historical and didn't take into account the sheer madness or the processes that went on in actual being a performer in making commedia. So by doing it and by thinking about it and by asking other people how they did it, I'm trying to build up a picture of I suppose the posh word is of a dramaturgy of commedia, which how you make it and why you make it. And I was kind of put back on the rails by a very nice man called Olly Crick from the Commedia School in Copenhagen, who basically said the point of commedia pedagogy is not to make good commedia pedagogy, it's to make better commedia. So I'm kind of interested in all the odd things that suddenly affect how and why a performance is made. And yes, I write about it and I do it, and I'm about to start making masks because it's lockdown time, and hey, I've got the time.
We've got time, haven't we? How and why performance is made. Avner, would you like to give us a little bit about your background? Very interesting.
Yeah, I never wanted to be in theater. In fact, I don't think I'd ever seen a play before I went to college. I was studying chemistry and biology and went into a building that turned out to be the theater to get out of a thunderstorm. And they were having auditions for a play, and I got a part. So
Wow.
I became a theater major. It was the 60s, why not? And but I was a crap actor, but I did mostly technical theater. I'd been a gymnast in high school. I'd been juggling since I was about 10 years old, and somehow ended up doing some street performing in New Orleans, and eventually took too many courses, graduated from college, had seen Marcel Marceau and was absolutely knocked out. He was, for me, he was a magician. He was making the Statue of Liberty disappear. But I couldn't find his address in the phone book. So I went to the Lecoq School thinking, well, one mime school is as good as another. And I think we were accepted for a 3-month audition period. And I probably spent the first 2 months complaining that we weren't learning how to do this. And then I had a real epiphany and realized what he was teaching was so much deeper and so much more important. And so I quit complaining and started praying. And luckily was invited to stay at the school. And yeah, that's kind of how I got here today.
Thank you, Avner. That's fascinating. I like that. Too many courses. We might come back to that shortly, actually. Howard, can you introduce yourself to us all, please?
I will. Hi, I'm Howard Patterson. I was one of the founding members of the Flying Karamazov Brothers. We were generally referred to as a juggling troupe. We never thought of ourselves as that. We thought we were a theater troupe that would do whatever we could get away with doing. And I had become obsessed with juggling myself when I was 10, I think, about 10 or 11, no, 10. And I did not realize how much juggling I did. I just thought it was a thing that I did. But we had, when my sister was ill, we, the whole family got together and hung out with her on her way out. And someone had taken some old home movies and put them on video, and we watched them. And in every one, I was juggling. And I did not realize that it was as much a part of my life as it had been. But I went to college to study biology. And the guy across the hall from me, who had started out studying botany, but was in a play in high school that changed his life, was Paul Maggie, had come to UC Santa Cruz, where I went to college, to study literature. And he was in some plays. He was where actually his first production was, he was in a commedia play. Wow. And where he played the devil. It was The Three Cuckolds by Baldoni. And he had a moment where he came out of a trap door and yelled incomprehensibly for a while. But and he also juggled a little bit. And we started juggling together. Actually, during summer break, oh no, before that, 2 friends of friends, Billy Barrett and Sandy Oxenhorn, who's now Sandy Grin from Cock and Feathers, who were very big clowning, juggling mime trio at the Renaissance fairs in California, happened to visit. I took them to a party. They were juggling. I juggled in my extremely stilted way, and they said, "Oh, you know how to juggle. Have you tried this and this and this?" And I hadn't. But the next day, I found out I had mononucleosis. And so during quarter break, I went back to my parents' house and juggled for 3 weeks. And when I came back, I had some tricks that I knew how to do. Came back to college, showed them to Paul. Paul is a man of ambition. And he went, "This is a thing. We will turn this into a thing." And so we ended up being valedictorians for a graduating class. We moved to San Francisco. We worked the street until we got some indoor gigs. He recruited one of the guys from his high school play to become a group. We went to Expo 74 in Spokane. We hitchhiked there, and there I came up with the name the Flying Karamazov Brothers, which I thought was funny.
Yeah, yeah.
It turned out not to be, especially that certainly most Americans have no idea who the brothers Karamazov are. So we doomed ourselves to a career of explaining why we didn't have trapezes or Russian. And we ended up playing 6 Broadway runs. We played Carnegie Hall twice, traveled all over the English-speaking world mostly, little events here and there that were not. And in the process worked with Avner quite a bit, who was very inspirational. I still do his Aikido wrist stretches daily, actually. Did 34 years of that, retired from the group 8 years ago now, 10 years ago. And now I do a lot of environmental restoration.
Oh, right, okay. Thank you very much, Howard. And Donald Lehn, can you introduce yourselves, please? A little bit of background, maybe who inspired.
Howard, environmental restoration means raking the yard?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. So I'm Donald Lehn, started more or less in the mid-70s as a juggler. Well, I started juggling, actually hitchhiking around Europe as a student in a period where it was what I call the big family, small car syndrome. So we spent a lot of time by the side of the road. This sounds like an invented story. It's the absolute truth. Just out of boredom, I learned to juggle 2 rocks with my right hand.
Wow.
Went to England, so I had to hitchhike with the other thumb and learned how to juggle 2 rocks with the other hand. I had no idea how to juggle 3 objects until I saw it in a movie.
Wow.
So I had this juggling thing. After realizing that engineering wasn't my thing, I got into literature and eventually started studying mime just to know how much you can say without words as a playwright, let's say, okay? And studying mime, all of a sudden, instead of being in my notebook as a writer, I was in my body as a performer. And I said, wow, I like this. And so I had this juggling, I had this mime background. It ended up working for a clown troupe in the Boston area, received some training from a Ringling Brothers clown. And as a way to get paid for rehearsal time, we started to go out on the street. Spent many years crossing the states back and forth, up and down, based in New Orleans. This is the time, Howard, where Sam Wise wasn't even a Karamazov yet.
Oh, wow.
Probably met on the streets at the University of Eugene or something. Bumped into Avner, I believe, at some point in Northern California, among other places, as a spectator. And has spent the last 40-odd years still performing, mostly street or nightclub or let's just call it low-key performance venues. And at some point ended up in Madrid. The real story is my van broke down and I had to wait for a spare part. I ended up finding people to teach as a juggler and people to learn from as a magician. And so I said, well, I'm going to spend a few months here. So that's been 30-odd years. And here I started a circus school, which is this spring graduating its 20th graduating class. That means we've been launched 20 generations of young performers into the world, sorry. And as such, my look towards clowning and towards the performing arts has sort of changed to somebody who has a general look towards what, how do we communicate those things, and not so much as a performer. I still escape to perform a little bit, but I don't do gigs. I go with Clowns Without Borders to refugee camps in Iraq and things like that. So I keep my artistic life alive, but it's just no time to be continuing doing real gigs.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? What's interesting is that the liveness of your work and the connections with the circus. What are your points of view on how the clown is sort of out of the circus and into the film? And I'm thinking of the films where, you know, we see quite a dark clown, like the Joker or the Stephen King's. We've also see, you know, this idea of a clown being even in our political system. What are your points of view on that mutation, as it were?
Okay, I'll go.
Yeah.
First, in my head, there's a difference between the social clown and the antisocial clown. No, as we're talking about darkness.
Mm.
So a guy is running naked down the street. You can laugh at him because you celebrate with him the provocative action in this slap in the face to social mores, or you can laugh at him because there's this guy being ridiculous and he's stepping outside of those social mores. So you can celebrate his provocation, his antisocial action, or you can condemn his antisocial action and laugh at him as a deviant. So I think that clowning, well, the buffoon in many ways has always been a deviant, but clowning in the circus in general has been more or less socializing, not antisocial. And it's when it jumps into the movies where we start seeing much sharper teeth in the clowning world.
Yeah, that's very good. Socializing. Anybody else like to jump in on that?
Well, I read an article years ago about how to look like a tennis player but never actually hit the ball. The right kind of clothing, the way to spin the racket, the way to blow on your fingernails. And I think that's true of clowning as well. I was teaching, I won't mention the country because this is a kind of derogatory observation. I was teaching a workshop. There was a clown festival in the city that we were in, and we went to their gala performance. And the next morning in class, I asked the students, so what did you think? They said, well, there were a lot of clowns on stage, but very little clowning.
Ah.
So when you mention the Joker, I don't consider that a clown. It's someone who dresses up like what people identify as a clown. I don't think there really is such a thing as a clown. There's clowning.
Yes.
Which is
Thank you, Avner.
Techniques and attitudes for solving problems.
Yeah, I think that, the women, we were talking that it's clowning. You can dress up as a clown, but not necessarily be the clown. Anybody else like to comment on that? Howard?
I have to concur with what Avner said. I think that is very much the case, that people thinking they are clowns as opposed to people clowning is a very frequent event in the culture, and authors like Stephen King have capitalized on this supposed deep-seated fear of clowns that people have and taken that into, we will take the accoutrements of the clown and use that as the basis for something frightening. But it doesn't bear a relationship to the act of clowning in any particular way. I mean, I was frightened of clowns as a child, as I think about it. Specifically the Ringling clowns, because their heads were shaped wrong. I was very small. Their heads were shaped wrong, and they didn't behave themselves. You know, they didn't act the way, I was still trying to figure out how people act, and they did not act the way people are supposed to act, as far as I could tell. So they unnerved me more than frightened me. I think I was never a screamer about clowns, but I definitely found them unnerving. I realize now that is the function of the clown to a certain degree, is to be unnerving. But these mass culture things take that sense of unnerving and put it in a different context that is not related to clowning as I understand it.
Thank you. And Olly, have you got any strong points of view on that?
I would simply agree that I think clowning is an activity. I went to the clown school with Frankie Anderson, I think in the late 80s, and then we all went, then a whole bunch of us went down to the Bognor Regis Clown Convention, and it was full of a lot of right-wing gentlemen in clown suits talking about doing magic shows for children. And it was, apart from a few guys from the Ringling Brothers who were there, who were very funny and were very highly skilled, there wasn't a lot of commitment to a level of personal eccentricity in front of people that kind of unnerved / giggle, made you giggle at the same time. So a whole bunch of us went, if this is clowning, I don't want it. But it was very much in a South Coast and a golf club you know, this is my job as a clown. I have my clown suit and my clown car, and it was kind of creepy. But then I believe putting a leather mask on your face and running around being funny isn't creepy. So that's, you know, that's kind of interesting. I think I just agree that clowning is an activity. There's some research. There's some research about neuroscience, which basically says why people, which kind of indicates why people find clowns scary at an early age, which is interesting because when makeup is applied, it upsets a part of our brain called the fusiform gyrus, which is a little bit of the brain that entirely deals with facial recognition. So that when we don't recognize what's in front of us, this is vast simplification, as not quite human, right? It sets our lower part of our brain into kind of, it just gives us loads of more, it does this thing called peak shift. It gives us more adrenaline, gives us more serotonin. And as grown-ups, we know clowns are funny. So that hit is being mediated by our higher cortex going, it's all right, it's a clown, they're being funny. As a kid, you don't know what it is. So the first reaction to masks and clown makeup, sometimes from a very little kid, is actually one of evolutionary biology. You know, something that doesn't look quite human or is disguising itself as something that's like a human is generally something you have to be aware of. You know.
Can we pick up on that then?
Okay.
So we have the red nose. Although Avner, you don't use a red nose in your work. We have the clown move wall of drag. That's and wall of androgyny. How do you see that right now, or sort of looking back and looking forward, that the use of the masks? I mean, I was brought up on, you know, my introduction to clown really was through the television, through watching Charlie Chaplin and all the black and white films where these film clowns were situated. So where are we now in terms of using those masks? Anybody like to pick up on that?
Can I just shoot you quickly, because I was talking about this yesterday, and it's actually a cultural thing to a certain extent. There's a commedia company in south of England called Rude Mechanicals who don't use masks, but they use whiteface of a particular kind because they think, or their statement is that masks aren't locked into the English, you know, cultural world, you know, unlike France or Italy, you know, or countries with Catholic carnivals where a mask is more of a recognized object. But we have more of a relationship as English with circuses. So they use like a light form of whiteface, like in character makeup, and it kind of operates as an icon that says this person is a funny person. And then yesterday we were talking about, if you put too much whiteface, if it's too white, if it's too blank, it then becomes scary, or it becomes too much of a cipher. So I'm kind of, what we were trying to work out, this is a commedia thing, so I'll shut up in a moment, but it was trying to work out what the relationship was between the masked characters and the unmasked characters. And the more you clown, the more you exaggerate the white face of the unmasked characters, the more everything becomes comedy rather than a balance, okay, between the unmasked characters who set the plot line down, and then the masked characters, okay, muck about in it or bounce off the plot and the audience.
So are we saying that the mask gives us, or the audience, a greater understanding of the comedy, or the more permission to be comical? Is that what you're saying?
What I'm saying is a mask acts as I'm not particularly, because it varies. It does actually vary within cultures, because like a particular mask is recognized in a particular culture. A mask on a neuroscientific basis hides, actually hides the face, which means that whoever sees it, there's a whole area of negotiation before you work out whether it's trying to eat you or whether you're going to laugh at it.
Yeah, in the world of mask, if we take mask as being costuming, not necessarily what we put on our face, does that give us permission to clown? And
yes,
I don't know. Have you got any points on the mask and or through clothing or any other device that helps a performer become ridiculous, enjoy being playful and connecting with an audience?
Well, first of all, my understanding of the white face is that it derives from the character of Pulcinella from the Commedia dell'arte, which, Olly, you're much more versed in that. But he was a baker's assistant, and that's why he's dressed in white, and why he has a white face, because he's got flour on his face. He's a bit of a simpleton. He wasn't smart enough to be a baker, but he could do the grunt work. The word clown means a rustic or a clumsy person, and I'd like to put to rest the preciousness of the red nose, if I can.
Yes.
But also to address the psychological need for clowning, which grew out of the early circuses, which were essentially horse shows, the earliest ones, which came from a time before the mid-1800s, before the Industrial Revolution, when the population was centered on small family and communal farms. And they all had horses. That was the motor that drove the farm. And every kid knew you don't stand up on a horse, and they all had broken arms to prove it. Now, the circus is the world of the virtuoso. It's the person who does things that cannot be done. We know from the study of drama that we need to have a certain rapport and empathy for the performer, and we can't have that for the virtuoso. We can admire someone who goes into a cage full of lions and tigers, but we can't really feel what they're feeling. We can't have empathy for the tightrope walker going up 30 feet in the air. We have sympathy, not empathy, and we need sympathy. Ours is the world of emotion, and that's where we connect. So there developed a character who would wander into the circus ring when these performers were standing up on horses. And he'd say, wow, that looks like fun. Maybe I could do that. And because he was sort of dressed like a dirty, uneducated, simple farm worker, he was one of us. And for him, we went, oh, no, don't. Whereas when the circus performer in their spangled costume says, I'm going to do this, you go, okay, go ahead, fine. So this character developed who would go out and in trying to do the things that the circus performers were doing would fail, but then succeed spectacularly. Now that takes a certain lack of inhibition. And the thing in our culture, and many cultures, all cultures perhaps, that removes inhibition is alcohol. The sign of alcoholism is the red nose.
Yes, indeed.
And that's why clowns wear red noses.
So
I know it's not true, but it's what I believe.
No, there is historical evidence on this, Avner. Thank you. The red nose related to the drunkard. So that sort of brings me back to like the male clown, really. When we were talking female clown the other day, we were talking for women becoming a clown was a huge moment, seminal moment of liberation. So can I ask you, sort of, Donald, that moment of, what is it for you? All of you, actually, what is it for you to be a male clown?
Well, first of all, I've never really identified myself that way. My character is a character who has a certain level of competency or incompetency in relation with more the objects than the other people he relates to. But I've never really felt that it was a role that has anything to do with masculinity. That said, for my generation, Avner, I guess, we all, Howard were probably included in this. There were notable female comic figures, Lucille Ball, Carol Burnett, the list is long, who were just as valid for us as role models as Red Skelton might have been. Just because of their way of dealing as an innocent, as an incompetent, with a supposedly competent world around them. And so for me, that gender issue is fairly recent, and I'm not sure I understand it that well.
Yeah, I mean, if you looking at books on clown, the clown in books historically has been a he figure, even though we know that women have been clowning. So, and women, you know, we do feel this sense of liberation. Anybody else like to comment on being a clown? Thank you, Donald, on that idea of not feeling need to be masculine. It's a way of being rather than gender. Anybody else? Sort of Howard?
Rather than addressing the question specifically, I want to talk about my particular relationship to clowning as such. The Karamazovs never wore masks. We didn't wear whiteface. We tried not to wear makeup if we could get away with it. We wore facial hair, basically, as a way to define our faces. Right. And it was the only time I can remember spending a lot of time putting on makeup was when I played a 103-year-old in our version of Le Pétoman. I played Le Pétoman's son at the age of 103. But so really, I specifically was what I came to realize later was a white clown. My character wanted to accomplish whatever ridiculous musical juggling thing we were trying to accomplish and took it totally seriously, and burst a blood vessel while the rest of the cast screwed it up. And what is sad about it and delightful is that it's what appeared to be happening, what was really happening. I really did take our oeuvre completely seriously. My girlfriend is with or was for many years with a string quartet, the Colorado String Quartet, and we played at Lincoln Center. We did our show that it was called Sharps, Flats, and Accidentals. It was basically all of the musical stuff we'd done over the years put in a show together. And I apologized to her afterwards because some of the pieces, the rhythm was not as clean as I wanted it to be. And the violist just went, "You take this really seriously, don't you?" Like, it hadn't occurred to her that I cared as much as I did. And then at that point I went, "Oh, okay, so I'm a clown." And the white clown role is not one that is familiar to American audiences particularly. And I guess it's derived largely from the Capitano character. It's the guy who is trying to maintain order in a chaotic universe and is a ridiculous order keeper was kind of my role. As far as gender, we were always we worked with many female performers in larger productions. The Karamazovs were always a male group, and there was often discussion, how come there aren't any women in your group? As well, because we haven't met the right one yet. I mean, it always seemed to us that if a person showed up who had the appropriate mix of juggling, musical, and theatrical skills and the same peculiar bent of mind, who happened to be of another gender than ours, that we would certainly have considered admitting them to the group. And I don't know if that's really true or not.
Right. So you this idea that there perhaps women aren't or weren't versatile or becoming upskilled in the juggling skills was the possible reason for them not being part of the troupe.
Well, it wasn't. The thing is that what we did, the thing we focused on in juggling, the two things we did that were different than what other jugglers do. One was what we call jazz juggling, which is improvisational club passing, where things fall on the ground all the time and we pick them up and put them back in, which now is just what jugglers do. I met jugglers at Burning Man who went, "Oh, you want to juggle?" And that's what they did. Where 40 years before, you couldn't get people to not stop if a thing hit the ground. Everyone, whenever we try to juggle with jugglers, they'd say, "Well, Hovey would have stopped." And Hovey Burgess, who was the person who trained pretty much all the jugglers or the teachers of the jugglers in America, would have. His idea was, if it's not perfect, we have to stop and start again. And then we worked with Hovey. He auditioned for Comedy of Errors, and it was true. He could not do it. He could not do the jazz juggling.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So when I came into the world of clowning, which isn't that long ago, looking at like less than 20 years ago, and like I said earlier, the books on clowning or clown, there were very few women in these books, even though, as we've said, there are women clowning. So and this idea that how we let women into or give them a greater platform, because even back in 2004, there was on places like Edinburgh Festival, there was very few women on the comedy scene. So even though gender's maybe not such thought of as being problematic in the world of clown, is it still problematic? And how do we encourage more women in this art form? Anybody like to come in on that?
Yeah. I teach quite a lot now. I've kind of fallen into that role, and in general, there are more women students than men, and I think in the future you're going to see more women clowning performers. There's just a time lag, but I'm noticing that there are by far more women than men. I think that in training in physical comedy and in clowning, that first you have to view yourself as a mammal, which means that there are certain rules of rapport, of self-defense, of how you deal with fear, how you deal with distance. And second, you have to be a human being, which is where psychology comes into it. And gender is the last thing to come in. And I find that people that try to emphasize gender first, their clowning suffers.
Okay.
It becomes polemical, and for men or women, that when the clown is a kind of pure human being exploring this problematic world that we live in, is where it's the most interesting. And I'd like to add something to what Howard said. I'd never thought of this before, of the white clown, but I just realized that Oliver Hardy and Ricky Ricardo and what's his name, Abbott?
Bud Abbott, yeah.
Bud Abbott. They are all trying to keep order. And how did you put it? They have an aneurysm watching their partners screw it up.
Yep.
I'd never thought of that before, but that's absolutely correct. Maggie, to address something you said, I think the books that you refer to almost always look first at the makeup and the costume, and then start talking about the clowning. Going back to, there were lots of clowns on that festival, but very little clowning. But then we've got Chaplin, Keaton, Abbott, and Costello. They're clowning all the time. Lucille Ball, Carol Burnett. But none of them look like clowns, but they are definitely clowning.
Okay, Olly, any comments on? Can't hear you, Olly. Need to unmute you.
No, you're muted, Olly.
You're muted, Olly.
Yeah, no, it muted because I haven't spoken for a bit. I'm more comedian than clown, but when I was clowning, my first attempts were actually political, in the sense of trying, I think, not to be all the worst traits of my dad, you know, who was kind of, you know, he was all right, but he was quite pushy and stuff. So you're trying, you know, not to be a bit of an archetypal male bastard, as you kind of see it in the 80s. So you're looking at different qualities within yourself, and some of it works and some of it makes you soggy on stage because you're pushing something in it. I mean, and this is just for myself. I can only speak for myself. Then I did Goliath, who kind of pushes you into danger zones for, you know, reasons best known to himself. And I found that a lot more people laughed when I was being bossy. You know, when I was actually being, you know, the bloke who was in charge, you know, giving themselves, you know, the aneurysm. And, you know, and my favorite bit of one of the shows that I do is when I try and do Servant of Two Masters with, okay, the audience, and you basically have to get them all up and tell them what to do and stuff. And my such fun is the joy when the member of the audience gets what I'm telling them, because I can be so artistically happy with them. And when they don't, I you know, you have the absolute joy of being completely frustrated and angry almost with them. So there's the whole thing of actually, I suppose, looking at it, it's the idiot in charge is funny, but while you're doing it, you really are trying to stay in charge, because that's the act.
Yeah, thanks.
In a sense, and I wouldn't have come across that. You know, I wouldn't have come across that without a kick up the arse, I know, from Gaulier, to push myself into that area, because I was trying to be softer than what, you know, a man was, you know, seen as in the early 80s and stuff. So in terms of gender, I'm, you know, you're playing with or against the characteristics that one sees, you know, inherent in one's gender, you know.
Well, I think, you know, going back to what you were saying, Avner, this idea of being a mammal and a human being, and drawing upon those qualities, whether that's looking at the world through the eyes of a child. I'm not quite keen on that phrase myself as an adult. No, it doesn't. Some people talk like that, but it's not personally for me. But this idea of sort of the sexuality, which very much, you talk about your classes, Avner, being, you know, a lot of women, and I think other teachers, I know Holly Stoppett talks about her classes are 80% women, so there's a lot of women coming to clowning now, and with that comes the stories and the material bodies of these women. I mean, when I started out, I was told, oh, clowns aren't sexual, and push me into this androgynous look, which in the end, I rejected. It can be very useful. So I want to kind of move on in a moment, but any kind of last thoughts on this idea that it is problematic when we come to gender, because the stories that are going to come out might well be coming from a female's perspective, i.e. from a female's storyline or lived experiences?
In a structural anthropological sense, clowns have always seemed to me that, so cultures tend to form binaries. There are binary values, and the characters that don't meet that binary, that aren't outside or inside, that aren't male or female, have a magic presence of their own, and kind of leave the plane of normal existence. In my mind, I'd always kind of thought of clowns, of classic clowns, as being non-gendered, of being between genders, and that's part of where their magic power comes from. He doesn't behave like a man, but he doesn't behave like a woman either. And the clown defying one's expectation of gender is where part of their magical power comes from.
Okay. Donald, anything?
Yeah, just quickly. So if the world of a clown is a deformed world, you know, the clowns all have their own emotional deformity or obsession. Perhaps the identification of the woman comes from their obsessions. A man's obsessions might be for power or for organization or for mastery, whereas the obsessions of a woman coming from the social context that she comes from might be different, or the way of confronting those obsessions might be different. But those are things which would be part of her clockwork, part of the things that make that person, that character, tick, more than a social, political, gender issue.
Okay, I'm just scribbling these down. Okay, any questions from I've got, just looking at the chat here, I've got something looking at nations, where is it? First Nations. So we're looking at broadening out culturally the clowning beyond beyond what we kind of know within the circus. Anybody has got any experience on it? I'd like to talk about that.
We had a group that we called the New Old Time Chautauqua. That was a bunch of vaudevillians and performers of various kinds who traveled around mostly the Northwest in the summer doing, at first they were free shows and no one would come, so we charged a few bucks. We went out to the Makah Indian Reservation where I had done archaeology as a youth, and they couldn't remember the name Chautauqua. It's Iroquois. They didn't have any idea. So they called us Howard and his friends, which I thought was very delightful. But our performance did not land with the Makah particularly. Most of what we did, they were kind of like, yeah, white people. And then Christian Swenson, who is an amazing physical performer, giant guy with tremendous physical skills, started doing animal impressions. And they went over so big. And they go, okay, now this we understand. Yeah, when bears scratch themselves on a tree like that, I totally remember seeing them do that. And I think at that moment I went, oh, this is actually what theater has been for most of our several 100,000 years, is people trying to do animal impressions. That's what like so much of Aboriginal culture is about. And then that gets focused into more human roles in the last few thousand years, maybe. Okay. That's all I've got about Aboriginal clowning.
Anything else on other? Are we moving away from our Western clown? Anything else? Anybody got to comment on? No.
I can't. I don't want to speak on it in case I've
no,
got a foot
that's
in it.
fine.
I mean, there's clues. I mean, if you're looking at even like old-fashioned anthropologists like Levi Strauss, wrote this very, very interesting book called The Way of the Masks, which has been sort of attacked down a bit about the Haida people and two particular masks used in potlatch or potlatch. I don't even know how to say it properly. And just in terms of mask and disguise, the cultural significance and the active role that these two particular masks, one represents giving and one represents taking. So in the sense they split society in half, and you vary between and which mask or which team you're in. These without going into too great detail, these become such fundamental keystones of a much older society that when we're using masks, I just think that we haven't even tapped into what our memory of them could be. So there's an awful lot of scratching on the surface in performing. And the animal thing, yes, it's about animal impressions, actually. That's amazing, in fact. Because there's always supposed to be an animal bit in a commedia mask. That's one of the things that, Donato Sartori, who reinvented the whole thing, basically said that, there's the devil, there's the role, and there's an animal in a mask. And the animal actually brings it back to this level of, you suddenly see a live beastie on stage, but then you're split into, it's actually a human as well. So there's a fundamental level of amazement when you start looking at a human who is behaving like an animal, who actually is an animal for the moment. So
thanks. Olly. It seems to be going back to the animal again, aren't we? Yeah. The animal in this. There's a remark here on the chat. There's about the encouragement. So socially, from a young child, boys are encouraged. Often, not all boys, that's a very generalized, to be transgressive, to play for laughs. Many boys have been clowning for laughs before they even start being performers. Meanwhile, many girls have been exploring empathy and emotional complexity, but are risking massive social stigma to be transgressive. And I know in some cultures that women are very much discouraged to clown around. So that's why I was going back to that, what does it feel like to be a male clown on stage? I think it's very different. If there are women to step into a clown class or step onto a stage, it feels very deeply transgressive. And when it does work, when they do get the response and the connection, that's what that moment of liberation. And sort of in the quotes in the chat here, it says about making room for inclusion and centering. So I'm just going to sort of leave that out there unless anybody else wants to comment on that. We are shifting into our last 10-15 minutes now. And so I've got a few more questions to ask. Anybody else like to kind of comment at all before we move on to our next, from where we are now?
Well,
Just a quick,
I'll add one. I'm
Thank
sorry,
you,
go ahead,
Avner.
Donald. Donald,
no,
go ahead.
go.
Oh, go Avner. Go.
I can't remember what I was going to say. Once you give up the idea that your clown character is something different from you, and start working on clowning, you can be telling a gender-rich story.
Yes.
And clowning happens in that story. But the whole thing is not clowning. Clowning is, and the way I define clowning now is in terms of problem solving, that clowning is involved in finding simple solutions to complicated problems and complicated solutions to simple problems. You can be doing Shakespeare, and there are wonderful moments that lend themselves as the character figures out how to solve whatever problem has presented itself. One of the things that was the genius of Lecoq was studying elements, materials, and animals. And one of the things that is often very productive, let's say a person is doing a scene and they triumph at something. And you say to them, well, if you were a cat, how would you react to that? And they do something. You say, well, how about if you were a snake? What would you do then? And it becomes fantastically inventive and available to the audience. One other last thing, I don't see clowning as being transgressive. It is being very serious about getting along in a chaotic world and trying to create order, rather than, I think, a very popular view that clowning is trying to create chaos in an orderly world.
I think the question around that is that, especially in this day and age, when we are very, we're on social media, everybody's being looked at and judged and critiqued. And so stepping over the boundary lines of what you should look like and how you should behave can be very challenging, and for some people very transgressive. So I do understand what you're saying, and I agree that about finding solutions to problems. But from my own perspective, it felt risky, and it just felt I was moving away from how I felt I expected to behave versus how I could behave, and therefore there was it felt like a sort of political move. That was my experience, and I'm sure lots of other women I've seen, they felt like they'd been doing something naughty or something slightly wrong if they were wiggling parts of their body that they're not supposed to be wiggling, unless, so that it is, I think it's that's a personal perspective, and actually it's not just because it's a perspective of some other people. I've just got a note here that said that First Nation people spends time with that women and men could clown equally. So any other questions? Thank you, Avner. That's very insightful, and getting back to the basics of finding problems to solutions. I like that analogy. Very beautifully. Anybody else like to add to that before I?
I mean, just the idea that clown, there has to be a degree of empathy with it. The split between the virtuoso performers and the characters you have empathy for seems a very interesting thing, because that reflects on makeup and its costume. If you're too different, just as a visual image, then you become something apart from the people you're trying to entertain or clown with or clown for. But if you are an exaggerated, shabby, epic fail, version of, of the normal people around you, then you immediately gain a bit of ridicule or sympathy. So there's definitely the degree of sympathy. Now you need to start, I think, or degree of connection. What you do with that as a performer, I think, is up to the performer. You know, the more gender opens up options and different expressions of gender, of character, of social class, of attitude, the more sometimes it can become so compartmentalized that the overall feeling of humanity can become swamped. So it's what, you know, if you are playing gender, there still has to be a fellow feeling with your audience. Otherwise you are distancing yourself from them, which kind of moves it into buffoon, a different kind of thing.
So
shall I stop digging my hole now?
No, I mean, just it's interesting, isn't it? The context. I'm just going to ask each of us, where are we now then? Where are we now with clowning, and how do we see it moving? I think Donald, wasn't there some work using technology in the circus, and isn't that happening?
Yeah, but as an educator, I think I'm a lot more concerned with the architecture of clowning, the composition, how do you develop? Is clowning instinctive, or is there really a way to develop comedy material? How do you define a gag? How do you take a funny idea and make it into a funny discourse, a funny dramaturgy? And I think all of that has a lot more to do with what makes a performer communicative. As of course, we're taking for granted that there is a motor, there is something in that person which is food for comic moments. We're taking for granted this empathy that Olly talks about, but beyond that, there's a process. You know, it's you don't learn to play the piano if you don't play scales.
Skills.
And so I think there is a skill base, and we could call it technology, you could call it an analytic mind, which then you have to remove the analysis and integrate into an honesty on stage. But it's something that interests me. You know, what is clowning about really as a artisanal process?
Thank you, Donald. Thank you. Avner, would you like to add on to that?
Wasn't listening.
We're talking about the craft of making people laugh, not just
absolutely. First of all, we have a motto that Julie and I developed, which is be interested, not interesting.
Yeah.
So when you said, I mean, something you mentioned, I don't know exactly what you meant. You said, well, someone's wiggling their bits in a certain way. My question is always, why are you doing that? What are you hoping to accomplish by it? As far as sexuality goes, I think it doesn't work to be sexual with the audience. That's very intimidating and scary, but it certainly can exist in the context of what's happening on stage. But I think my most common or most often question is the observation you're trying to be interesting, which is violating one of the basic principles, which is don't tell the audience what to think. And when you're being interesting, you're telling them you should like this. So much more important to be interested and let the audience join you.
Thank you, Avner. Thank you. We haven't got long. Just while I sort of talk about what's happening next week, just on a very light-hearted note, I'll perhaps come up with something. How are we going to save the world, folks? Just have a little think about that and keep it as light-hearted. So this is the first discussion this week. They're going to be bi-weekly on Wednesdays and Sundays. So keep an eye out on Clown Power with Dave Spathaki. As I said earlier, if you can donate some money or money towards watching this. That's going to help with all the work that goes into putting this on, and the connections for that will be coming up shortly. So just very quickly, on a very light-hearted note, us clowns, how are we saving the world, folks? Anybody just like to pitch in on that?
You know, when you go to, sorry, Olly, let me just go for a second.
No, yeah.
When you go to Sri Lanka right after the tsunami, when you go to the refugee camps in Kurdistan, and you're working with people who are really in very extreme situations, you realize how powerful how lucky we are to have a skill which has a real value, a real meaning in these situations. Just an anecdote, a father with a, must have been 13, 14-year-old kid, he was big, in his arms after the tsunami. And he tells us that he was holding on to a tree and holding on to his mother's arm, and he'd lost her. Okay, so we're talking about a child who entered semi-catatonic state because of a very real, very profound emotional trauma. Watching our show, he came back to life. He reacted. He looked at his father. He smiled. He gave him a kiss. And so it was literally jump-starting a heart, jump-starting a life. And if laughter, if our skills have the power to do that, I don't care what we do in a nightclub. We are really saving the world with laughter.
Wow, thank you, Donald. That's fantastic. Really moving.
It was, yes.
And yeah, bringing a child back to life. We are lucky to have these skills. Anybody else like to add on to any of that? Thank you, Olly. I know you've got to.
Yeah, no, I've just got to disappear. So thank you very much. I'm just going to say, my mission now is to encourage people to form a commedia dell'arte company in every single major town and every single county, in order to perform I'll use the word politics, the politics of local issues in a funny way, because the dialogue and concourse of politics has been so utterly destroyed by, you know, I won't even mention their names and the parties they belong to. But in order for people to actually see that it's okay to laugh and to debate issues, okay, that affect them, and to be able to laugh at the situations there are at. So, you know, my mission is that every county in the US, in England, anywhere, should have its own little commedia company made up of characters that represent that locality. So anyway, on that unassailably foolish ambition, I'm going to sign off and rush off and look after
Olly, thank you for putting it out there, and thank you for joining the panel today.
My pleasure. Love you, folks. Rock and roll. Yeah, I'll try and work out how to leave this thing.
No, that's the funny bit. This is Hotel California, you know.
I'm checking.
I like that. A commedia company for every town and village, and a child coming back to life. This is profound. Anybody like to add on to that? Avner?
Well, you know, clowning is a lot like pornography. You can't really define it, but you know it when you see it. Doesn't answer the question you asked, but I thought it was amusing.
Pornography and clowning. There's a lot of clowning in, Louis, let's not go there.
By the way, if I can give a little plug, the play One Man, Two Govs.
Oh, yes.
Streaming for free now for this whole week. And if you haven't seen it, it's fantastic, and you can see Cal McChrystal's work, who's probably the best physical comedy director working today. And on that note, Spy Monkey, my favorite comedy troupe, is offering free streaming of several of their shows for 1 week at a time. So you really shouldn't miss that.
That's great, Avner. Great plug there. You know, if you think of anything else, plug again in a moment. But just on to Howard. How are you going to save the world, Howard? Come on.
It's all about recreating community.
Yeah.
And both human communities, botanical communities, ecological communities, and theater skills can certainly have a great deal to do with that. It's about connection, and in a world where political ascendancy has gone to people who get their power from dividing people, it is from connection and commonality that we can reestablish the kind of world I think we all would like to see. And if I think that clowning in particular is theater about connection.
Thank you. It is. I mean, we've got a lot of C's winding up there. You know, we have commedia, community, and in the time that we're going through now, community is so important, and making connections is so important, and that skill to be clowns and reaching out there. I think we're very, 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 very lucky. Someone's written down here, yes, clowning is like pornography. Thank you, Avner. It's hard to define when you see it. Thank you. And any more plugs before we start to wind up and say thank you?
Just thank Dave for his commitment to the whole
Yeah.
Clown Power universe.
Oh, Thank you, Dave Spathike. Thank you very much for bringing this esteemed panel on this Sunday afternoon, UK, Sunday morning, US, and thank you to the panel for sharing your thoughts where clowning is right now, and how important this art form is. You can look out for this on YouTube, being posted in the next few days, and on next week again on Wednesday and Sunday, there are going to be more clown panels with more fantastic people. So from this clown panel, a round of applause for Avner Eisenberg, Howard Patterson, Don Lehn, and Olly Crick. And can we hear?
And Maggie Irving.
Oh yeah! Oh yeah!
Maggie Irving, thank you.
I,
you so
I
Well
can,
done.
I can almost hear them roaring. My cheeks are red, my nose isn't. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Tears of joy.
A real pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a great night or day, depending on where you are.
Back to bed, folks.
Be well and stay home, guys.
Yeah, stay well.
And if you can't succeed every time, learn to fail magnificently.
Oh, bravo, bravo. Avner, that's fantastic. Everybody, you're wonderful. See you some other time. Great to connect.
Ciao.
Ciao. Gotta get out of here now. Thank you, Dave Spathike.
Can't. There it is. Okay. Bye.